So I'm gonna take off a little bit where John left off, and it's important to conceptualize where Lenin is writing and acting. And basically, as you know, John mentioned, he's often marginalized. But you also have to keep in mind there are these titanic figures, and I mean that in all senses of the word. These titanic figures of Marxism who are accepted as the orthodoxy. And John, of course, talked about Plekhanov. Plekhanov was the Russian titanic figure in which everyone deferred to him. Everyone believed that because he brought Marxism in a substantive way to Russia, was the proper way to go. And everyone looked to him. And so in order to, and this is one of the great tragedies of Lenin's life, in order to break with the terrible policies of Plekhanov, Lenin had to break with Plekhanov proper. And the other major figure in Marxism at this time is Karl Kautsky from Germany. And he received, if I'm not mistaken, he directly received the inheritance of Marx and Engels' entire works. Either it was through Bernstein or he received them directly. But along secession, he was the inheritor of all of the works of Marx and Engels. And internationally, everyone agreed with Kautsky. He was the accepted orthodoxy. And he also was a titanic figure in worldwide Marxism. And of course, the reason being is Plekhanov was not willing to move forward with revolutionary insurrection, the seizure of the state, party discipline. And Kautsky was not willing to move forward in denouncing imperialism, in denouncing World War I. And as a matter of fact, Lenin constantly said, the most famous, right? So let me sort of give an example. He wrote an essay called Marxism and the Renegade Karl Kautsky. To sort of make it a little easier to conceptualize, this would be like Denis Kucinich writing the Democratic Party and the renegade Barack Obama. Right? You're dealing with the main figure of Marxism in Europe. And he writes this polemic saying that Kautsky is, he doesn't use the term revisionist, but an opportunist, an economist, that following his policies will disintegrate the international movement. And as a matter of fact, as John said, when World War II started, it did. Or, sorry, World War I. Freudian slip there. So what happens is Kautsky and all of these other European Marxists support the war, essentially. And they say, oh yeah, this is an imperialist war, but you know, we should still defend our country against aggression. And Lenin says no, absolutely not. So much so that they literally have a term for it, and again, John alluded to it, revolutionary defeatism. This is literally the position of Lenin, is we should actively do whatever we can do to make sure that Russia loses the war. So, I mean, conceptualize this. The United States is currently engaged in an imperialist war in Iraq where our safety is not threatened at all, really, in any substantive sense. Yet, how many leftists are willing to say we should actively do whatever it is we can do, whether that means smuggling military personnel off bases and creating an underground railroad so they can get out of the country, so they can go AWOL, if that means they should be fragging people, right? What leftist is willing to say we should do whatever it is that we can do to lose this war? And again, this is not the life and death struggle of World War I. And so you have to keep in mind, Lenin is a radical rupture with the Marxism that comes before. He is something fundamentally new. And of course, as he mentioned, right, Lenin is constantly changing his positions, and this is because he's a Marxist. He's a materialist. He believes that there are certain conditions in the world, and that our actions, strangely enough, should mirror these conditions. So you have World War I. They practice revolutionary defeatism. Lenin is in Switzerland. And he says, you know what, this is it. So Lenin begins, gets passage by the Germans on an armored train, comes to the Soviet Union. You have the February Revolution, which the Tsar is forced to abdicate. Lenin is there with his famous peace, land, and bread, right? Peace being an end to the war, land being a redistribution of land from the landed aristocracy to people who work the land, and bread being food for the cities. And so he comes with peace, land, and bread, and it's moderately successful through the provisional government, which is put together through various liberals like the cadets and the social revolutionaries, which are essentially the Mensheviks, and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks win a very small amount, but the Bolsheviks manage to get control of two important cities, Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And so they use this power because they control the councils of these cities, of which the provisional government is in St. Petersburg. But across the country, right, they have a very small support. And so what they do is, this is where the famous phrase by Lenin comes, all power to the Soviets. And I will talk a little bit about this before. The Soviets are not the same as the provisional government. This sort of period passes, the provisional government continues the war, right? Because even though it's led by the social revolutionaries, ostensibly a left-wing group, they say, well, we're socialists, and yes, this was started as an imperialist war, but we made obligations to the Western allies that we needed to follow through, and we need to defend Mother Russia, right, against evil Germany, even though we're socialists. And so they continue the war, and they begin an offensive in, I believe, July. And the offensive goes horribly, and it's a slaughter. So Lenin gets the Bolsheviks to try and organize these demonstrations and tries to seize the government. It's an absolute failure. Lenin is forced to flee Russia, and the July days are an absolute failure. The war progresses even worse and worse. Lenin returns in disguise from Finland, where he was in exile, and in October, November by their calendar, advocates once again for the seizure of the state. And of course, all of the other party members know this is ridiculous and it's hopeless. We didn't have enough support to seize them during the July days. What makes you think that we're going to be able to do it in October? But Lenin is insistent, and they do it. They seize the government, they seize the Winter Palace, and this is the October Revolution. So when Leninists talk about the revolution in Russia, they're not talking about the February Revolution, of which the Tsar abdicated. They're talking about the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks seized the government. Well, essentially, long story short, they fight an incredibly bloody civil war. Rebels, peasants, striking workers who are refusing to create armaments to keep the cities running are brutally suppressed in the name of a policy known as war communism. And again, material conditions. If you're in a state of civil war in which you are literally every side, east, west, north, and south, you have enemy forces plunging at you, the material conditions say, we should do whatever is necessary to ensure the survival of the revolutionary state. And so Lenin does this, and the policy is war communism. It's incredibly brutal. And I'd highly recommend our lecture on the Kronstadt for just one aspect of it. But it's successful. And ultimately, in 1922, all the whites are driven out, all the foreign powers, again, the United States invaded, Great Britain invaded, France invaded, Japan invaded, along with the White Russians, who were seeking to establish essentially an absolutist right-wing dictatorship. Had they been successful, our word for fascism, if I may quote someone I incredibly dislike, had they been successful, our word for fascism would probably be Russian instead of Italian. But the Bolsheviks are successful. Again, the material conditions are then that we need to rebuild the economy. And in this case, Lenin steps back and institutes small market reforms under the new economic policy. Lenin has several strokes and then dies. And and it's not the NEP goes to the discussions between the left opposition, which includes Trotsky and I believe at this point Zinoviev, and the rest of the party, which is Stalin and Bukharin and the rest of the party leadership. And so with this, Lenin dies and leaves it to his successors, which if you have questions about Stalin and his period after, I would again recommend our lecture on Stalinism for some aspect of that. But what I'm going to deal with now is Leninism. And I'm going to deal with it theoretically. And I'm also going to deal with it both, one, in his context, and I believe with a strong emphasis on Leninism for our context. So what are the similarities between Lenin's context and our context? As I see it, there are two. The first is when Lenin is writing, beginning his career with what is to be done, and as John pointed out, the numerous party congresses, there is a lack of revolutionary organization. They are basically starting from scratch. They have nothing. And so one of the questions that they're dealing with is, how are we to organize a revolutionary party to essentially overthrow capitalism? Now, of course, in the United States, we had the 60s where there were a bunch of parties, and how revolutionary they are depends on how sympathetic you're feeling. But we don't have that now, right? The most active and probably powerful communist party is the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and it's an isolated party that is mostly on the West and East Coasts. So the situation that confronts us is we do not have a revolutionary party or a revolutionary organization. So that's the first similarity. And the second similarity is this. Lenin was besieged by unorthodoxy. Unorthodoxy about how a revolution could be made, what was possible and what was impossible. And this orthodoxy told him that you should not organize your party centrally and with discipline. It is not necessary to have a revolutionary vanguard. It is not necessary to engage in political and revolutionary struggles because economic struggles are enough. And Lenin was a radical break. He was a break from all of these ideologies and these theories, but he was also a radical break from the men and the communists who supported these, Plekhanov and Karl Kautsky. Right now, we live in an orthodoxy. And again, we're a non-tendency organization, but I'm going to argue this as a Marxist-Leninist. So I want to be clear, this is my position. We live in an orthodoxy. And our orthodoxy is ultra-leftism. And it can go by autonomia, it can go by the name, or anarchism, or crime-think, or any number of organizations, or at this point, they're not even organizations. They're loose-knit conceptual ideas. And we live in an orthodoxy of spontaneity, that any organization is inherently alienating and hierarchical and will lead to counter-revolution. And anyone who talks about organization or discipline or truth or right or the organization of workers both politically and economically in an organization with rules and strictures and discipline is essentially an outcast. And so today, the radical new idea, if I can be permitted to call it new, is itself Leninism, against all the new leftists who are now old and tired. So in this case, right, my lecture on Leninism is going to focus theoretically, because I can't focus on everything, on these aspects that make Leninism timely to us today. So with that, Lenin remains one of the most important and prolific writers in history. One must always run into difficulties condensing the thought of a great thinker into a single lecture. However, I believe I can address Leninism with three main theoretical contributions, again relevant to our time. First, Lenin added to Marxism the notion of imperialism and labor aristocracy. Second, he argued for the theoretically advanced revolutionary vanguard as the nucleus of revolution, Finally, and relatedly, he viewed the state as necessary and linked to his theories of the revolutionary vanguard. And again, the state as a means of one class oppressing another. And I'll get into more detail of this. And again, however, one should always understand Lenin's polemics as primarily focused at his opponents of the day, namely the opportunists, the economists, and the revisionists. So, Lenin's theory of imperialism aimed to explain why workers in developed nations often refuse to support the revolutionary struggle. Under Marx's conception, capitalism expands its exploitation to the workers. This puts the workers directly in conflict with their capitalist oppressors. However, at the turn of the 20th century, European powers began colonizing Africa and Asia. These imperialist powers began exploiting not just their resources, but also the local workers to make products for them. By forcing these imperial colonies to accept foreign capital, right, that's capital from the imperialist nations, they could continue to exploit the local population while ostensibly only using local companies, right? So the profits of all this labor would accumulate to the more advanced capitalist countries. And the excess of profits allowed for the capitalist countries to pay certain skilled workers a higher wage than those workers, than other workers in their nation or around the world, right? These key specific jobs like skilled factory worker could be paid a little bit more to sort of diffuse the tensions, right? So these workers who receive an extra cut of the imperialist profits are the labor aristocracy. And the labor aristocracy forms itself, again, out of the workers who gain the biggest return from capitalist imperialists to keep the peace in more developed capitalist countries. They become satisfied with their position, and when they do engage in struggles, they only struggle for themselves. They abandon universal class struggle for their own very narrow economic interests. And of course, we can see this today in the relatively high-paid union members who still buy cheap products from China. But of course, right, they refuse to fight for the unionization of other workers. So it's the job of revolutionaries to break the labor aristocracy in favor of workers as a universal class and to oppose imperialism wherever it raises its head. However, the core of Leninism, right, as a revolutionary theory, lies in his notion of revolution and state, or the party and the state. So Lenin reacted very strongly to a trend in Marxism occurring at this time, that I mentioned briefly earlier, that many refused to see the goal of communism as a long, drawn-out class struggle between workers and revolutionary organizations on one hand and the capitalists on the other hand. Instead, they thought that some opportunity would present itself so they could avoid the long struggle and bring about a revolution immediately. So, in this case, this term became known as opportunism, right? And its supporters would be opportunists because they were waiting for an opportunity to act on that. Now, one branch of opportunism seeks to organize the workers in economic struggles and focus simply on the day-to-day without worrying about raising their consciousness. So this term became known as economism, and their supporters as economists. Finally, these economists only wish to focus on getting people into trade unions, what we would just call unions, and were unsurprisingly called trade unionists. And this was only the most dominant form of opportunism, but there were others. The anarchists and the agrarian socialists, as John mentioned, practiced another form of opportunism, and that was terror. They believed that terror could shake people from their slumber. However, Lenin, even if he issued some sympathetic remarks, viewed them as either a symptom of poorly organized revolutionary groups or an attempt to shortcut the difficult task of revolution by engaging in these hopeless, futile, perhaps, if you're sympathetic, heroic acts. And if you'd like to learn more about this, our lecture on the Weather Underground really shows what terror manifests itself as, and also, to a certain extent, its futility. So Lenin viewed the task of true revolutionaries to not engage in violent acts on the hope for some spontaneous awakening in the people. Instead, he viewed the task of the revolutionaries to build the organization that could create revolutionary class consciousness in the workers. So how do you do this? Well, Lenin argued for revolutionary theory, professional revolutionaries, and strong party discipline. In opposition to the trade unionist tendency, Lenin argued that workers should confront political problems above and beyond narrow economic interests. So Lenin's focus on theory stood in contradistinction to the economist's theory, or mode of action, right? The economists thought that workers would spontaneously gain class consciousness, right, their recognition of their position as a class under capitalism, or they would gain revolutionary consciousness, right, the idea of how to overthrow capitalism and how to organize. However, Lenin argued for the incredibly crazy and controversial position that the predominant ideology in bourgeois society is bourgeois ideology. And of course, most new left thinkers believe that the workers will just spontaneously organize and come up with a revolutionary ideology. So if you find it commonsensical that under a capitalist system, most people will have a capitalist ideology, then you probably agree with Lenin in this case. So he argued that revolutionary theory itself comes from rigorous theoretical work done on our society and the various relationships in our society. The most advanced theoretical thinkers then need to confront, expose, and teach these advanced theories to the workers so that the workers can better understand their position under capitalism. It's quite easy for bourgeois ideology or capitalist ideology, or the owner's ideology, right, the dominant elite ideology, to explain to workers why they should form a union. And the simple reason is this. If you believe in capitalist ideology, it makes a lot of sense to form a union because then you can sell the products of your labor, right, your hour or your salary of your life for a better price, right? So you can justify joining a union for just personal gain, right? However, it's much more theoretically difficult and much more theoretically advanced to explain how the workers' union, factory, and particular capitalist owners fit into the entire capitalist system of oppression and exploitation, right? So one only needs to explain to you you'll make more money if you join a union. One explains to you that the goal of the union is to struggle to end capitalist exploitation as such, which requires a great deal more theoretical work. So Lenin said, without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. He thought, often Lenin is accused of elitism. However, he thought that workers could and wanted to learn the most advanced concepts, but the professional revolutionaries would consist of those, workers, student, intellectual, what have you, who remained the most theoretically advanced. And these advanced workers were termed by Lenin the revolutionary vanguard. So these theoretically advanced workers and students who form the vanguard would need to organize themselves into a revolutionary party. So this brings us to our next concept. And the revolutionary party would organize and centralize vital functions of the struggle, from coordinating worker strikes to putting out a newspaper. This vanguard party would coordinate these central efforts. Moreover, these actions would require people to dedicate themselves full-time to this task. Right? As Lenin says, right, if a worker is good at organizing a factory, what they should be doing is not working 16 hours a day, but organizing factories. So these essentially would become professional revolutionaries that the workers could look to for leadership and organization. And of course, the most advanced workers would ultimately join these professional revolutionaries through the support of the party. So that worker who organized their factory by themselves would be recruited from the party, and the party would provide some subsistence means, a small apartment or a collectively owned house, food, shelter, clothing, And then it would be the task of this worker to then engage in full-time revolution, thus transferring from a factory worker into a professional revolutionary, right, part of the revolutionary vanguard. So in this organization itself, Lenin viewed democracy of this organization as a functional one. Rather than working on the impractical principles of necessarily complete open publication for all actions and the elections of all members, which Lenin called toy democracy, Lenin argued for individuals to form their own revolutionary connections and hold party discipline as a matter of course to those who seemed most able. So, however, as a matter of course, all of these revolutionaries would need to exercise the strictest discipline in regard to their fellow revolutionaries. And he says this about that. They have not the time to think about toy forms of democratism within a close and compact body of comrades, in which complete and mutual confidence prevails, but they have a lively sense of their responsibility, knowing as they do from experience that an organization of real revolutionaries will stop at nothing to rid itself of unworthy members. Moreover, there is a fairly well-developed public opinion in Russia and the international revolutionary circles, which has a long history behind it, and which sternly and ruthlessly punishes every departure from the duties of comradeship, and quote-unquote democratism, real and not toy democratism, certainly forms a component part of this conception of comradeship. Take all this into consideration and you will realize that this talk and those resolutions about quote-unquote anti-democratic tendencies, and again, this is, as John mentioned, those people who are criticizing Lenin for not being open and democratic enough, they have the musty odor of the playing at generals, which is indulged abroad. So essentially these people want to play at being the general of the revolutionary, rather than engaging in the real revolutionary task at hand. Or alternatively, they want to play at general instead of doing what is to be done. So, through these actions, Lenin and a relatively small party of Bolsheviks were able to secure the victory, again, over the Western powers, the white counter-revolutionaries, and other ineffectual or counter-revolutionary groups, like the social revolutionaries, like the anarchists, like the Makhnovists. So, once this disciplined revolutionary party has seized the state, right, has led a successful revolution, this leads us, quite naturally, to Lenin's conception of the state. So, Lenin states clearly that every state, including the most democratic republic, is nothing but a machine for the suppression of one class by another class. So, under feudalism, the state is used by the aristocracy to suppress the other classes. And under capitalism, it is the bourgeois or capitalists or owners who use the state to suppress the other classes. And under communism and socialism, the state is used, depending on how exactly you want to frame those terms, the state is used to suppress the bourgeois class, right, the capitalists. And of course, Lenin puts this into practice. So Lenin used methods as wide as expropriating the capitalist property, that means seizing and taking capitalist property, right, through land reform, as John mentioned earlier, and making it property of the state, to only allowing workers and peasants to vote in key elections, right? This is what's meant by all power to the Soviets. Those are factory and soldier councils. And there were no capitalists that were allowed to be part of the Soviets. So when you say all power to the Soviets, you are de facto removing the capitalist right to vote. And so he did this. Now, of course, Lenin believed, as I stated earlier, that capitalist ideology was the dominant ideology under capitalism, but he did not believe that this capitalist ideology could hold sway forever. So, over time, the state would gradually wither, since it was no longer needed to suppress the other classes, most notably the capitalists, and since no other classes would exist but the proletariat, the workers, right, it would begin to disappear. Thus, the very use of the state would end in the abolition of the state. For Lenin, this formed the essence of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And of course, if you're interested in the dictatorship of the proletariat, we also have a lecture on that you can find on our YouTube. So, as one can see from Lenin's work, it reflects a commitment to theoretical work and discipline. And I think, as I've stated earlier, this remains more relevant now than ever before. So I'd like to close with a story that he gives at the beginning of What is to be Done, which provides a good view of his outlook, and I think very much sums up our situation today. We are marching in a compact group along a precipitous and difficult path, firmly holding to each other by the hand. We are surrounded on all sides but enemies, and we have to advance almost constantly under their fire. We have combined by freely adopted decision for the purpose of fighting the enemy and not retreating to the neighboring marsh, the inhabitants of which, and this would be Karl Kautsky and Western Marxist, from the very outset have reproached us for having separated ourselves into an exclusive group and have chosen the path of struggle instead of the path of conciliation. And of course, right, this would be Plankenoff and the Mensheviks. And now some of them begin to cry out to us, "Let us go into the marsh." And when we begin to shame them, they retort, "What backward people you are! Are you not ashamed to deny us the liberty to invite you to take the better road? Oh yes, gentlemen, you are free not only to invite us, but to go wherever you will yourself, even into the marsh. In fact, we think that the marsh is your proper place, and we are prepared to render you every assistance to get there. Only let go of our hands. Do not clutch at us. Do not besmirch the grand word freedom, because we too are free to go where we please. Free to fight not only against the marsh, but against those who are turning us towards the marsh." Thank you very much.
Take questions?
Yeah, how do we want to work questions? Do we want to break into groups?
I prefer to just take questions.
Yeah. Any questions? Any at all?
This is something coming by the way.
Bueller.
That was dense.
Your mom is dead. Okay, any questions?
Here's like a
Oh, yes.
I have a question. Were you talking?
No, I was just like a dumb joke. So
Oh, yeah.
So you were talking about the proletariat being taught social theory. Well, you described how, like, I guess in essence it would be a life promotion because they get like apartments or whatever. Who would be doing the work?
Well, here's the thing. Even a badly paid worker is generally better paid than a community organizer. So it's actually not a life promotion.
Okay.
So once they are promoted, if we can use that term.
Well, yeah, that's just.
Yeah. So again, not
I
huge
got you.
criticism. They would do the work. And so instead of spending 16 hours a day in a factory, you would spend 4 hours a day working on publishing a newspaper, and then 4 hours a day on the streets, selling newspapers, talking to people, and then you would spend the remaining 4 hours, running study sessions. And then if there was a party function, you would spend hours and hours setting that up. Or if you were trying to organize a new union, those professional revolutionaries would help those workers organize into a union and make collective demands against their factory.
So that would be being a full-time revolutionary.
That's exactly right. And so they would do whatever is necessary for the party to organize the proletariat as a class, to change from a mass of workers who have no structure, no organization, no connection to each other, into a compact organization where they can effectively fight against capitalism.
He makes a delineation too between agitation and propaganda. And what agitation is you're talking to people. You're like, hey, why is it the case that Bill Gates has millions and millions of dollars and sits on it, and Paris Hilton does the same thing when your family is dying of diseases because they don't have health care? Right? Why do we accept the disproportionate distribution of wealth in our society? Like, this is completely unjust and we need to get rid of it. That's agitation. Propaganda is proper, like actually doing the rigorous theoretical work to actually explain why these aren't the case.
So like the capitalist system, the domination of workers by the capitalists. And so, right, basically anything you could think of that would get workers to understand they're being exploited, teach them how they're being exploited, and then organize them against that exploitation on all levels. So.
Or it would just seem like the workers would just be agitated, like what you just said.
there's the thing, though, like, they can be agitated and be all like, oh yeah, I'm really angry about this, but where does that anger go?
Not necessarily. So let me give an example. France has a really terrible communist party, and I would not recommend it to anyone. And so what happens is France is really good about agitating the workers, all the various groups there, about how they're being screwed over and about how things suck. So what do the workers do? Now, I'm not criticizing this per se. They kidnap or assassinate their bosses. Okay, yeah, as a tactic, that might be effective to get your factory open, to get a better wage. But what that's not going, you can't kill enough managers to overthrow capitalism. That requires a fundamentally different sort of organization. So what happens is all those workers have been agitated to realize they're being screwed over and be very, very angry about it. But that doesn't necessarily entail that that anger is going to be channeled in a productive, organized fashion. And a good example of this would be May 68. You had a bunch of people pissed off about a bunch of things. So they flipped over a bunch of cars, they burned a bunch of buildings, they sprayed a bunch of graffiti. And at the end of the day, they got slightly better wages, but at the end of the day, everything basically went back to how it was before. Right? There wasn't a fundamental shift. So what I would advocate for, and what Lenin is advocating for, is not just making those workers angry about their situation, but getting them ready and organized so that they can not just fight that individual battle, although that individual battle is important, but to win the war, the class war, and abolish capitalism as a system. So, just a side note, right, this is one of the things the RSU does. We table, we invite friends, we invite people we meet elsewhere, right, and that, that can get them interested or excited about, revolutionary ideas or make them angry about capitalism. But it's things like theoretical and historical lectures that actually give them the foundation to begin to understand what capitalism is really doing to them, how it's doing to them, and what they can do to fight against it. So, just a local note. Is that a hand?
Yes. I don't know how familiar you are with the organizations now. There's not very many organizations in the United States, at least, that will pay full-time political organizers, but there are some. So one, I'm not sure, just if you don't know enough about them, that's fine, but I was wondering how you would compare that to, the way that a professional revolutionary would work and the discipline in the organizations we see today that have, because the discipline is very important to them as well. I don't know how you would contrast that discipline to a Leninist discipline.
Well, a lot of it has to do with aims and approach. There's a whole mass of various communist parties, from the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Party for Socialism. I absolutely do not want to lump the Party for Socialism and Liberation with the Revolutionary Communist Party, or the Communist Party USA. But all of these people have paid people who do stuff, ostensibly, like put out a newspaper. Revolutionary Communist Party puts out Revolution. I forget what the rag the Communist Party USA puts out. It's universally awful. And that's something, right? And then, of course, you have community organizers like in Chicago, Barack Obama was a community organizer. You have the Industrial Areas Foundation, I believe this is what it's called. And they also have people who are paid to do things, to organize. Well, the problem with the communist parties is they very rarely actually go out into the community and agitate. And so they're not sufficiently Leninist enough because they don't actually organize the workers proper. Now, community organizers, be they religious or some god-awful Saul Alinsky break-off, yeah, they go out to the workers in the communities, but their ultimate aim, despite whatever they say, is social democracy, which is a happier, friendlier capitalism. So this is a radical break. Leninists don't want a happier, friendlier capitalism. They want the ability and organization that is able to overthrow it. So all organization they do is not to empower communities qua empowering communities. It's to prepare those workers for the revolutionary seizure of the state.
Can I just
Yeah.
be clear about my question? Yeah, there are very fundamentally different aims there, but in terms of tactics, they're like, for instance, the IIF organizers use a specific series of tactics that involve, interviewing lots and lots of people one-on-one before they ever plan actions, so that whatever they do will be set within a community, and they have a specific kind of discipline in terms of who they will reject from their organizations and why. And I understand, yes, there's a fundamentally different aim there, and I certainly wouldn't expect anybody who's trying to be a revolutionary to emulate that. I was wondering, in terms of their specific tactics and their approach to discipline, if there's any way you feel that this is applicable, if there's any way you think that it's not applicable because of the foundational differences.
Okay, yeah, actually, people, right, vanguard actually, right, means the advance guard. It's the approaching part of an army, right? And so a vanguard is always at the forefront. But then there's the rear guard, which in an army defends the supplies and is at the back, or fights a rear guard action when the army is retreating. It's the part that stays behind. So the vanguard is in contact with workers. But what it does is it generates new struggles or creates the possibility for new struggles ex nihilo. Or no, not ex nihilo, out of the concrete condition. So Lenin makes this really clear, right? The vanguard needs to get the workers to fight against all injustice, against everyone, everywhere. Now, there's no inherent disposition among anyone to fight for anyone else, right? So the vanguard has to actually bring this revolutionary theoretic, which is not self-interested, which is not based on their individual subjectivity, and this is again why revolutionary theory is so important. And so it brings new struggles, completely unknown, to the workers to fight. When you, yeah, okay, it's helpful in some ways at some times to understand what a community wants, but that doesn't necessarily entail that that's an advanced struggle. Because what differentiates a vanguard is the vanguard leads the struggles. It's pushing the workers towards more and deeper conflicts with capital. Whereas if you just take a survey of what the workers want and what their interests are, that might be helpful. But if that's all you're doing, and then fighting those struggles. So let's be clear. You find out what they want, you find out how their lives suck, and then you fix those problems. Then all you've done is just reinforce the rearguard ideology of the workers. You're just chasing after the workers for whatever they want. The vanguard leads, the rearguard follows. Does that at all?
Yes.
Okay. As in regards to discipline, in this case, it's a matter of organizational and structural discipline over not necessarily any individual discipline. So let me give two examples. Plenty of revolutionaries in the Russian Social Democratic Party and the Bolshevik wing did very immoderate things. Most of them were drunks. Lenin himself had a case of nerves and was prone to stress. Stalin was rude as hell and not particularly friendly. And so these individual problems never really were important, because the importance of discipline was organizational discipline. And sometimes that even meant going against the explicit will of the party. So here's the second example. Right, John pointed out that Lenin fell out of favor with the Russian Social Democratic Party, especially after 1905. And one of the questions was, what do we do about violence? Now, at this point, they had gotten some moderate gains, and so it seemed very commonsensical. What we shouldn't do is threaten those very moderate gains that we had made. And what we shouldn't do is, engage in revolutionary struggles to overthrow capitalism. Well, here's the problem with having an entire immigrant party, right? A party of immigrants, they're all living in Europe, is somebody needs to fund that. And so Lenin said, you know what, we should rob banks or rob trains and use money to fund our party. and reintroduce socialism to Russia. So a young man by the name of Yosif Drugashvili, who would later be called the Man of Steel, also known as Stalin, believed in this party discipline, right? As a revolutionary vanguard. Lenin saw the Russian Social Democrats as going the wrong direction, and he believed this was the correct policy, right? So it's organizational. He was willing to make a break for the organization of revolutionary struggles. And out of party discipline, right, Joseph Stalin left the Russian Social Democrats. He left the party at the behest of Lenin to rob trains and funnel that money back to the party. So again, the question is always contingent on the historical conditions. Sometimes what it means to have party discipline is to not question publicly in any way, shape, or form the orders coming down, to do exactly what is asked of you as soon as it's asked of you, as was necessary during the Russian Civil War. But sometimes, for the sake of the vanguard, right, leading the revolutionary struggles, what's necessary to exercise party discipline as a cohesive political entity is to leave the party and act completely against the orthodox, reactionary, rearguardist party demands. And so in this case, right, Stalin was actually exercising proper party discipline. But, and again, this is the big difference between a Leninist group and a social democratic group or a community organization, is the goal is revolution. And you can only have party discipline insofar as you are engaged in acts of revolution. And so, I mean, this is a radically different notion of discipline than most liberal organizations or social democratic organizations have.
This is just a general comment, but again, most of what I'm going to be saying is also about what is to be done. But you'll notice what he's arguing against your opportunists, right, the economists and the terrorists, is that they sort of divided their struggle, right? You have the terrorists trying to carry on a revolutionary political struggle, but not trying to include the working class. And you have the economists trying to fight for the working class without making it a political struggle. And so this is where Lenin says, no, it needs to be both, but it also needs to be very rigorous and disciplined. So, right, take for instance, say the people at factory A get fired, or whatever, well, you know, they're having their own struggles. The people at factories B and C, as well as all the other people, right, again, the people of the class of proletariats, not just simply, the industrial workers, but everybody included in the class needs to be supporting factory A at the same time. And this is what it's meant by solidarity. So,
right, and the Central Party organization, through newspapers, through donations, through worker strike funds, right, coordinates all these efforts of solidarity and support, right? And it can, because it's central, it has contacts with factory A, B, C, and D, and it has operatives in A, B, C, and D, always, you know, in close contact with the workers, and able to distribute centralized party commands. This is a concept of Leninism that I didn't touch on too much, is democratic centralism. A, B, C, and D have a say on who is in the party. They have a say on who gets to, as opposed to being burdened and saddled with being a professional revolutionary. And that's fine, and that's good. But then once that person is a professional revolutionary and the party is chosen in its central authority, then everybody needs to follow that central authority when it makes decisions. Now, if you don't like it, make your own party. Leave. I mean, this is the real message of Lenin. That's fine. You want to go back to the marsh? Go back to the marsh. Just don't drag us with you. And so, I mean, this is the essence of democratic socialism, is everyone has a say on the central decision, but once that decision is made, it's made. And we need to follow it, or we need to have a radical break with the party, which Lenin did. Stalin literally left the party to do what he thought was necessary for revolution. And that's good, to leave the party, to have splits. As Mao said, a revolutionary party gets stronger by purging its reactionary elements. So, yeah. Additional questions? Anyone?
Do you want to tell the Jasinski story?
The jet ski story?
The Jasinski story?
Luke Stravinsky? What, about him being a factory worker?
Carjacks.
Oh, yeah, well,
Sorry, Harvey.
it's not particularly germane at this point. But one of the big criticisms against Lenin was his brutality, his absolute brutality and his police state, which was done by the Cheka, which is essentially the police, this secret police, like the FBI. So Lenin was driving from St. Petersburg to Moscow, and a bunch of guys came out with guns. And they're like, you need to get out of the car and give us the car. And we're hijacking you, and we want this car. And so the people with Lenin are, do you know who that is? That's Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who is the leader of the country. And I believe this is in 1919. And the carjackers are like, that's cool. Also, get out of the car. We're taking this car. Or actually, it might have been, yeah, I think it was early 1919. And so Lenin had to walk to the nearest, Lenin and the entire, all the people in the car had to walk to the nearest telephone and call for a ride. So the leader of the Soviet Union was carjacked on his way to Moscow. Very shortly after, the Cheka was formed under Felix Stravinsky, good old Iron Felix, who was a factory worker. And basically, they proceeded to, I'm trying to find a delicate way to put this, just be a bunch of the most raging badasses possibly in the history of the world. And they fought counter-revolutionaries, they fought white Russians, they fought traitors, and they fought organized crime. And people don't realize this. Organized crime was about as prevalent in revolutionary Russia initially as organized crime is prevalent in Russia today. Notice you don't hear much about organized crime under late Lenin or Stalin or Khrushchev or Brezhnev. And the reason why is because the Cheka did a really good job about disincentivizing with bullets anyone who felt inclined to engage in criminal organization. So again, the state is not just going to repress counter-revolution. Well, it's not going to just repress political counter-revolutionaries, but it will also repress those who, through their actions, are counter-revolutionary. Is that sufficient?
Yeah, and I think it's important to keep in mind that if, per se, since the revolution is tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of reactionary forces, such as biker gangs, other, et cetera, that are probably going to, I don't know, throw a wrench in the works here and there. And if there's not something, a mechanism in place to deal with it, to the revolution moving forward.
Yeah, and you'll get essentially a criminal fascistic regime. And yeah, the Nazis were a criminal regime, and if you're interested in that, again, you can look at the lecture on the dictatorship of the proletariat. Any additional questions? All right. Anyone up for ABGs?